In 1778, if you walked through the streets of Buenos Aires, nearly 1 in every 3 people you passed would have been black. The sound of African drums filled the air. Families gathered in vibrant neighborhoods. Children played in the streets. This was Argentina before the disappearance. But today, less than 1% of Argentina identifies as Afro-Argentine. An entire population, millions of people, seemingly vanished from the face of the earth. This is not a mystery. This is not an accident. This is the story of how a nation deliberately erased its black citizens from existence. The year was 1810. Argentina was fighting for independence from Spain. The Spanish Empire was crumbling, and brave men were needed to fight for freedom. But who would fill the ranks? The answer came quickly. Black men, both enslaved and free, were recruited by the thousands. They were promised freedom if they fought. They were promised equality. They were promised a place in the new nation they would help create. General José de San Martín, the great liberator of Argentina, knew he needed soldiers. His army of the Andes, which would cross the mountains to liberate Chile and Peru, was filled with freed slaves and black volunteers. These men were not just fighters. They were the backbone of Argentina's independence. They marched through ice and snow. They fought in brutal battles. They bled for a country that would later pretend they never existed. But here is the dark truth. While black soldiers fought on the front lines, white officers stayed safely in the rear. The most dangerous missions were given to black battalions. The survival rate was devastatingly low. In battle after battle, black men died in numbers that shocked even their commanders. By the time independence was won in 1816, thousands of black soldiers lay dead in unmarked graves across South America. Yet the wars did not stop. Argentina continued to fight, and black men continued to die. The most catastrophic conflict was still to come. Between 1864 and 1870, Argentina joined Brazil and Uruguay in a war against Paraguay. This conflict, known as the Paraguayan War or the War of the Triple Alliance, became one of the bloodiest wars in South American history. Argentina needed soldiers, and once again, black men were drafted in massive numbers. But this time, the recruitment was not about promises of freedom. It was about getting rid of a population the government no longer wanted. Historical records show that black men were specifically targeted for military service during this war. While white men could pay for exemptions or send substitutes, black men had no such options. They were rounded up from their neighborhoods, torn from their families, and sent to the front lines. The war was brutal. Disease, starvation, and combat killed hundreds of thousands. And among the dead were nearly all of Argentina's young black men. When the war ended in 1870, something horrifying became clear. Entire black neighborhoods in Buenos Aires had lost their men. Families had no fathers, no sons, no brothers. The gender imbalance was so extreme that black communities could not rebuild their populations. Women outnumbered men by staggering margins. Marriages became rare. Births declined. A community that had survived slavery and centuries of oppression was now on the edge of extinction. But the nightmare was not over. In 1871, just 1 year after the war ended, yellow fever struck Buenos Aires. The epidemic swept through the city like wildfire. Thousands died in a matter of months. Bodies piled up in the streets. Entire families were wiped out overnight. The disease hit the poorest neighborhoods the hardest, and these were the places where black Argentines lived. The government's response was telling. Wealthy white families fled to the countryside. They had the resources to escape. But black communities, already devastated by war, had nowhere to go. They lived in overcrowded tenements with poor sanitation. They had no access to medical care. When the fever came, they died in massive numbers. For decades, Historians claim that yellow fever was the main reason Black Argentines disappeared. But recent research tells a different story. While the epidemic was deadly, it killed poor European immigrants at similar rates. The real difference was what happened after. European communities received aid. They rebuilt. They were counted in the census. But Black communities were left to die in silence. And speaking of the census, here is where the story becomes truly sinister. In 1778, the Spanish colonial government recorded that Black people made up 30% of Buenos Aires and 44% of cities like Córdoba. These were official numbers. They could not be denied. But as Argentina moved toward independence and then nationhood, something strange began to happen in the records. By 1810, census takers started using new words. Instead of Black or African, they wrote Pardo, which means brown. They wrote Trigueño, which means wheat-colored. They wrote Murco, which means dark-haired. These words were deliberately vague. They blurred the lines. They made it harder to count how many Black people actually lived in Argentina. Then, in 1887, the government made a decision that would change everything. They stopped recording race in the census entirely. With one administrative decision, Black Argentines became statistically invisible. If you do not count a people, you can pretend they do not exist. And that is exactly what Argentina did. But why? Why would a nation work so hard to erase part of its own population? The answer lies in the vision that Argentina's leaders had for their country. In 1868, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento became president of Argentina. Sarmiento was a writer, an educator, and a man obsessed with one idea: European civilization. He believed that Argentina could only become a great nation if it became a white nation. He looked at the United States and saw European immigrants building a powerful country. He wanted the same for Argentina. But there was a problem. Argentina had too many Black and indigenous people. Sarmiento wrote openly about his beliefs. In his books and letters, he expressed disgust toward Black and indigenous Argentines. He called them obstacles to progress. He believed they were inferior. And when he became president, he turned these beliefs into policy. Under Sarmiento's administration, the government launched what historians now call the whitening policy. The plan was simple: encourage mass immigration from Europe, specifically from Italy, Spain, and Germany. Give these immigrants land, jobs, and opportunities. At the same time, marginalize and segregate Black and indigenous populations. Push them into the poorest neighborhoods. Deny them education. Deny them health care. And send their men to die in wars. The policy worked. Between 1870 and 1914, nearly 6 million Europeans immigrated to Argentina. The population of the country exploded. Buenos Aires transformed into a modern city. But as the white population grew, the Black population seemed to shrink. Not because they were actually disappearing, but because they were being deliberately erased from the national story. Children in schools were taught about European heroes, about the great Italian and Spanish immigrants who built Argentina. But they were never taught about the Black soldiers who fought for independence. They were never taught about the African rhythms that gave birth to the tango. They were never taught the truth. And the tango. Let us talk about the tango. Today, tango is seen as the symbol of Argentina. It is performed in theaters around the world. It is elegant. It is passionate. It is European. Except that is not where tango came from. Tango was born in the poorest neighborhoods of Buenos Aires in the late 1800s. It was a mix of African candombe rhythms, European melodies, and indigenous influences. The early tango dancers were Black, mixed race, and poor white immigrants. They danced in the streets, in bars, in brothels. It was considered vulgar. Respectable society wanted nothing to do with it. But then something happened. As Black Argentines disappeared, tango was whitened. European musicians adopted it. They cleaned it up. They took it to Paris. And when Paris loved it, suddenly Argentina loved it too. But by then, the African roots were forgotten. Today, most Argentines do not know that tango has black origins. The dance survived. The people did not. The same thing happened to Candom, the African drumming tradition that Black Argentines brought from their ancestors. In the early 1800s, Candom festivals filled the streets of Buenos Aires. Thousands gathered to dance and drum. It was joyful. It was powerful. It was a connection to Africa. But the government saw it as a threat. In the mid-1800s, Candom gatherings were restricted. Then they were banned altogether. The official reason was public order. The real reason was that the government wanted to erase visible signs of blackness from Argentine society. The drums fell silent. The festivals stopped. And within a generation, most Argentines forgot that Candom ever existed in their country. Today, Candom survives in Uruguay, Argentina's neighbor. But in Argentina, it is almost completely forgotten. The rhythm was banned. The people were erased. And the memory died. Now, let us talk about what historians call racial mixing or mestizage. As black men died in wars, and black women were left alone, many married or had children with European immigrants. This was not always a choice. It was often survival. A black woman in 1880s Buenos Aires had few options. Marrying a white man meant better opportunities for her children. It meant escaping some of the discrimination. It meant her children might be classified as Murco or Trigueño instead of black. Over generations, families became lighter. And here is the key. Argentina's racial classification system rewarded whiteness. The whiter you appeared, the more rights you had. The more opportunities you had. So families actively tried to distance themselves from blackness. They stopped speaking about African ancestors. They destroyed old photographs. They changed their stories. This was not just social pressure. There were actual laws. In the late 1800s, Argentina had voting laws that said you needed to be 2 generations removed from slavery to vote. Think about what that means. If your grandfather was enslaved, you could not participate in democracy. This created a powerful incentive for families to hide their African heritage, to claim European ancestry instead, to erase themselves in order to survive. By 1900, the transformation was nearly complete. Buenos Aires looked like a European city. The population was overwhelmingly white. The government's whitening policy had succeeded. But it was not a natural demographic change. It was social engineering. It was erasure. It was cultural genocide. In the 1910s and 1920s, Argentina celebrated its centennial of independence. There were parades. There were monuments. There were history books. And in all of these celebrations, Black Argentines were invisible. The soldiers who fought for independence were not mentioned. The communities that built the nation were forgotten. Argentina presented itself to the world as a white, European country in South America. A transplanted piece of Europe. And the world believed it. Even today, many Argentines are shocked to learn their country once had a large black population. They are taught in school that Argentina is different from other Latin American countries. That it does not have the racial mixture of Brazil or Colombia. That it is purely European. This is a lie. But it is a lie that has been told for so long that it feels like truth. In 2010, Argentina conducted a census that, for the first time in over a century, asked about African ancestry. The results were revealing. Only 0.365% of Argentines identified as Afro-Argentine. That is less than 150,000 people out of a population of 40 million. But here is the important detail. The question was optional, and it required people to self-identify as having African ancestry. After more than a century of being taught that blackness is shameful, how many people would voluntarily claim that identity? How many families have completely forgotten their African roots? How many people have African ancestors, but genuinely do not know it because the history was erased from their family stories? Genetic studies suggest the number is much higher. Research shows that millions of Argentines carry African DNA. It is in their blood. But it is not in their identity. Because identity is not just about biology. It is about memory. It is about history. It is about what you are taught to value and what you are taught to hide. Today, a small community of Afro-Argentines is fighting to reclaim their history. They are teaching Candom to new generations. They are researching their ancestors. They are demanding recognition. In 2013, the Argentine government officially recognized Afro-Argentines as a distinct cultural community. It was a symbolic victory. But symbols do not undo 150 years of erasure. Walk through San Telmo, one of the oldest neighborhoods in Buenos Aires. The buildings are beautiful. The streets are charming. Tourists come from around the world to see the colonial architecture. But beneath those cobblestones lies a different history. This neighborhood was once the heart of Black Buenos Aires. Families lived here. Communities thrived here. And when yellow fever struck in 1871, they died here. The wealthy families who owned these buildings fled. They never came back. And when they did not return, European immigrants moved in. The neighborhood was reborn. But the people who built it were forgotten. Today, there is no memorial. There is no plaque. There is nothing to tell you that this was once a black neighborhood. The erasure is complete. But here is what they could not erase. The rhythm. Even when the people were gone, the beat remained. You hear it in Argentine music. You hear it in the way people move. You hear it in the tango, even though most dancers do not know where it came from. The African heartbeat of Argentina could not be completely silenced. It went underground. It hid. But it survived. There is an old saying among the few remaining Afro-Argentine families. They erased us from the books, but they could not erase us from the soul of the nation. This is true. The blood is still there. The culture is still there. It is just hidden beneath layers of denial and forgetting. So what really happened to Black Argentines? Did they disappear? No. They were disappeared. Through war, disease, discrimination, and deliberate policy. Through census manipulation and racial reclassification. Through economic marginalization and social erasure. Through the destruction of memory and the rewriting of history. This was not a natural process. This was not just demographic change. This was a choice. A choice made by leaders who believed that Argentina could only be great if it was white. A choice enforced through laws and policies. A choice that destroyed communities and erased histories. The story of Black Argentines is a warning. It shows us how easily a people can be erased. Not just physically, but from memory itself. It shows us how powerful the control of history is. If you control what is written in textbooks, what is taught in schools, what is remembered in national celebrations, you can make an entire population vanish. But it is also a story of survival. Because despite everything, despite wars and diseases and policies designed to eliminate them, Afro-Argentines did not completely disappear. They are still there. In the faces of people who do not know their own history. In the rhythms of music that has been claimed by others. In the bloodlines of millions who have forgotten where they came from. The question now is, will Argentina remember? Will it acknowledge this history? Will it teach its children the truth? Or will the forgetting continue? In recent years, there are signs of change. Afro-Argentine activists are speaking up. Historians are uncovering the truth. The government has started, slowly, to acknowledge what happened. But acknowledgement is not enough. Memory must be restored. History must be taught. And the contributions of Black Argentines to the nation must finally be recognized. Because they were there. They built the roads. They fought the wars. They created the music. They raised the children. They made Argentina what it is. And for that, they deserve to be remembered. Not as a footnote. Not as a curiosity. But as an essential part of the nation's story. The drums of Candom are starting to sound again in Buenos Aires. Small groups gather to play the rhythms their ancestors played. Young people are learning the dances. The beat that was silenced is slowly returning. It is quiet. It is fragile. But it is there. And maybe, just maybe, Argentina is beginning to remember what it tried so hard to forget. That it is not just a European nation transplanted to South America. That its soul is a mixture of many peoples. That its strength came not from racial purity, but from the contributions of indigenous, African, and European peoples working together. The faces may have vanished from the streets. The names may have disappeared from the records. But the spirit remains. In every beat of the tango. In every rhythm that makes people want to dance. In the blood of millions, who do not even know they carry Africa within them. They were here. They are still here. And their story, finally, is being told.